All right, welcome everybody to RadPod. I hear a crazy echo, but that's not unusual. This is a news breaker with our good friend Craig Unger. He's a veteran investigative reporter, and most notably, his most recent book, American Kompromat. That's going to be one of the things that we are revisiting, but he's also known for House of Trump, House of Putin, House of Bush, House of Saudi, and many other books. So I just wanted to say hello. I'm glad that you are here with us. And Craig, so much has happened since the last time you visited us. Trump's been indicted. We think this might be the week we see some high level January 6th indictments. I don't know if that's hopium, but I believe there seems to be activity moving in that direction. We have high level seditious conspiracy convictions with Oath Keepers and Proud Boys. And we also really brought you here today because we've talked about this before. Russia was very effective propaganda. You've spent a career proving the grooming that was done with Trump in relation to Russia. You interviewed almost 60 people for your most recent book, evidencing his connections and ties to Russia. Are you seeing a sea change at all in people's understanding just how much of an asset Trump has been to Russia?
It's really genuinely hard to say, partly because of the demise of Twitter. For me to, I don't have contact with people who follow me quite the way I used to. Twitter, as you know, is not what it used to be. And that was the primary way I communicated with people. I do think, though, there is some, to me, the work I've done and its relationship to what is happening now, I think it provides an important context. And a lot of what I do, most of what I do is not about the law at all. It's not about what's going on inside the Justice Department and when the trial will get done or not. But what it is about, it's about how power works and about Trump's relationship with the Russians, in the case of both these two books. On the one hand, the first time with House of Trump, House of Putin, I really talked about his relationship to the Russian mafia. And it's important to remember the Russian mafia works hand in hand with Russian intelligence, the FSB now, and for that with the KGB. And in addition, there's Trump in American Kompromat, how the KGB recruited Trump. And that goes back to 1980. So it's important to have a broad historical sense of the degree to which they really own Donald Trump. And they really, really do. And this has been going on for, I traced it back 43 years.
Wow.
So part of his life.
Wow. I'm just hoping that there's some sort of sunlight on it. But what you said about Twitter is so profoundly true. It was always a very, very imperfect public square, but it was our very imperfect public square. And it has become absolutely unwieldy. And I'm sorry to hear that it's having an impact on actually your understanding of where people are at in relation to this story.
No, well, it absolutely is. I'm not, obviously there are a lot of other social media platforms that are vying to take Twitter's place, but I don't think one has really emerged in a dominant way yet.
Guys, go ahead and jump in, because of course I have a ton of questions.
The current biggest alternative to Twitter is Threads, which is, Mark Zuckerberg, who got a whole shit ton of money from the Russians. So I'm not sure we're gonna. For me, social media is it's gonna it needs a complete reboot.
So one of the books you wrote was House of Bush, House of Saud. And in that book, you talk about a $1.4 billion deal done between some companies that Bush was attached to. And people gave you a lot of flack about that. But right now, what I've seen is that Saudi Arabia handed Jared Kushner $2 billion. Live Golf has purchased PGA and is now moving tournaments to Trump properties. It seems to me that this is corruption on a much greater scale than even the Bush debacle, and yet we hear nothing about it. It's not like it's a thing. It's a blip and then it's gone. What are your thoughts on that?
Right. Well, no, I'm old enough that I was a child at the time. This goes back to the Eisenhower administration, but Eisenhower's chief of staff, Sherman Adams, was forced out of office. He was enormously powerful White House chief of staff, but he took, and it seemed to be pay-for-play scandal, an overcoat. Granted, it was a very fancy overcoat, but he got paid with an overcoat, and there was such a national uproar that he was forced out of his job. And as you say, now Jared Kushner gets $2 billion, and it's greeted with a yawn. And I do think people have become numb to things, to so much. It's just extraordinary. If you look at what I did with House of Trump, House of Putin, I never got any factual criticisms as in, oh, Craig, you got these wrong factually. It's people would just dismiss it as, okay, so he sold a lot of condos to Russian mobsters. So what? Well, there is a big what. I don't know how many, but I found at least 13 Russian mobsters who were in 721 Fifth Avenue, that is Trump Tower, where Trump lived. I mean, can you imagine if Hillary Clinton had 15 Russian mobsters living in her house? I mean, it would be extraordinary. And yet, there is this double standard that the Republicans get away with murder. It's also, there's no, one of my favorite sayings, and I have to give credit to it, it's Mike Kinsley, who's an old friend and a journalist, who used to be on CNN a lot, and was the editor of the New Republic. But he used to say that the real scandal is what is legal.
Yeah.
And it's the absence of regulation. So when I talk about Trump laundering millions and millions of dollars for the Russian mafia, if a Russian mobster came into his office in 1984, as one did, a man named David Bogatin, he puts down $6 million. That's the equivalent of about nearly 20 million today. And he says, I like 5 condos. And Trump, of course, doesn't ask, did you get it? I have FBI files showing David Bogatin's ties to the Russian mafia. But Trump, of course, doesn't say, did you get that out of the sex trade or whatever. He doesn't. And it's very hard to prove that he knows. And he's smart enough not to ask where it really came from. So he can plead ignorance. And the regulations with regard to real estate are so lax that it's virtually impossible to prosecute him. And that happened again and again and again. He sold about 1,300 condos under those circumstances. That is all cash deals to an unnamed entity like a limited liability company.
I just want to bring up a couple of years after that meeting, he literally went to Moscow, right?
Right.
I mean, one of the things that boggles my mind about things that are legal is, for example, a guy like Trump going to Moscow and then coming back here and putting a full-page ad for the U.S. to get out of NATO, right? What is the possible reason that this real estate dude would suddenly, be super anti-NATO, right?
Right.
Why is it that even now, 40 years later, we haven't convicted this guy of foreign influence?
Right. Well, the real estate regulations, I mean, I've not investigated it thoroughly, but presumably there's a lobby for lobbyists keep those regulations being so lax. I mean, the real estate industry profits off it enormously. I'm here in New York, and we have all these new needle-like skyscrapers that are like 18 feet wide and 1,000 feet high, and they're empty. They're, each unit might cost $80 or $100 million, and people, the oligarchs park their money in it. It's a great way to launder money because of those lax regulations, and that's been part of Donald Trump's life. When I say 1,300 condos, think of it. A bottom of the barrel condo studio in a Trump building is like $1 million. So using that as a baseline, 1,300 condos, you're already up into the billions of dollars. And he went bankrupt again and again and again. But $1 billion here and there helps out and allows.
Just a bit. So I have a whole bunch of quotes I want to run down with you because when I interviewed you first, when American Kompromat came out, you basically said in my interview with Byline Times, the big thing people don't see is this is a war. It's a war without bombs and bullets and boots on the ground, but it's with cyber warfare. It's with disinformation, all these things like QAnon. And so what I am seeing now in 2023 is the really alarming beginnings of what we can expect in 2024, which is a complete and utter shit show of disinformation. And I wanted to kind of get your thoughts on that. And then I've got a follow up.
Right. Well, part of it, I mean, as you were asking the question, one of the things that was striking to me was I was also writing about the Russians and their hybrid warfare, and they have stupidly reverted to military warfare in Ukraine, and they're doing much, much more poorly than anyone would have thought. I can only think that they had to do that once Trump was ousted. And if Trump was still in office, NATO would have collapsed, and Ukraine would have collapsed as well. So that's something, a big factor to keep in mind there. I mean, I think one of Biden's greatest accomplishments is he brought NATO back together like that. He really did. And I didn't know that was so possible. But NATO, under Trump, the United States was not a reliable part of NATO. And without the United States, NATO isn't worth an awful lot. But now we see it functioning, and it's helping Ukraine enormously.
I mean, we're also strengthening it. Now we have NATO, in the high north, which is very big strategically. So I agree. I've been heartened by the NATO, the success of NATO, especially Erdogan, to be honest with you. I don't know what strings Joe Biden pulled, but he turned Erdogan around on a dime. I don't know if you have any insight into that, but that was a pretty interesting move.
I don't really, but that is why NATO is important. And, it's... I think for most Americans, NATO is a weird abstraction, and they don't think about it in their daily lives. But here we saw it really come into play as a major player in world politics.
Yeah.
So among the other brilliant things you said in that interview, and that dovetails beautifully with what we're talking about, is that right at the beginning when we talked, this is again on American Kompromat, when I first interviewed you, I think maybe it's been already probably 2 years or going on it. You were like, it's preposterous, this idea of having a Russian asset in the White House, and yet it's true. And if we don't come to terms with that reality, it will happen again. It can happen again. Now, we are watching a lot of the pro-Kremlin narratives be delivered through people like RFK Jr. and others. And I think the most important two things that you've said that have always stuck in my head is that Americans do not have a shared narrative of truth anymore. And that is something that that has become kind of like marching orders for me. Like, how do we get to that? I think one of the ways we get to that is by coming to terms with the reality that we are a target nation of this type of warfare, that assets are being deployed all the time. And if we don't see convictions at the highest levels, and I am talking about the Trumps and the Flynns and the Stones, then I think that we will continue to have disrupted truth in perpetuity.
Right. No, well, you know, I think that's part of America's DNA in a way that we can't come to terms with the truth. And we were born lying. That is, if you go back to Thomas Jefferson, when he said all men are created equal, he didn't mean women. He didn't mean African Americans. He didn't mean his kids. He had 6 kids with Sally Hemings. He didn't mean, he wasn't including them. So it's not all inclusive, and we lie about that. And it's convenient for us to ignore the truth, and we've always done that. I think that's part of America, and that, and I also think it's a truism that if you don't confront the truth, it'll happen again, and that's what we see happening again and again and again. And I think in a lot of ways, what Trump is, he hasn't changed the Republican Party so much as he's revealed it for what it really is. And this kind of thing has been going on under the covers in its quiet, unseen way again and again and again.
Wow. Mic drop moment. Hi-Fi, did you want to jump in? I've got something else.
So, you know, we talk about Russia. And I think with what we've seen that it's not just Russia, although Russia plays a very large part. But now we've got, you know, an unregistered foreign agent for China who's Israeli born. We have the Saudi connections. We've got stuff going on in the UAE. What's coming up for you? Have you taken any projects to look at kind of the wider geopolitical landscape and how this is affecting America?
Well, to be honest, I'm going back in history really to 1980, because the 1980 presidential election, that really happened then as well. And there's not been one serious, there have been a few good books about it, but not one comprehensive book to put everything together, I think. And that's what I'm trying to do.
Oh my God, I'm getting chills. I am so excited about that. I've been going back in time too, and I think it's so important. Can you give us a little hint about that?
Well, there was a piece in the Times a month or so ago that sort of got to it. I mean, it was about a piece by Peter Baker, and Ben Barnes, who had been Lieutenant Governor of Texas, came forward to the New York Times. And he said back in 1980, he was traveling with John Connally, the former governor of Texas, and a close friend of Ben Barnes. And Connally had been a Democrat, but he switched to the Republican Party and was desperate for a cabinet post in the Reagan administration. And he was sent around the Middle East on behalf of the Reagan campaign to talk to leaders in the Middle East and get the message to Iran: don't release the hostages. If you release the American hostages, Jimmy Carter will win the election, so don't release them. And of course, that's what happened, and that was the beginning of the Reagan era. And there's just so much more there I can't tell you. It's a great spy story.
I'm so excited. Yes, Hi-Fi.
I just have to ask one question. Does the name Jack Singlob appear anywhere in that whole
Well, a little, but I'm not sure exactly. I know the name, but it's a long story.
Yes, I can't. Oh my gosh, I can't wait to read.
I love long stories.
You're gonna come
down. That is an amazing story. I've looked into it a little bit, and I cannot wait to hear.
Well, I investigated. I started on it 34 years ago.
Wow,
that's cool.
Wow.
I wanted to, if you don't mind, just for our audience, remind people of Paul Manafort, because for me it is the sort of the clearest pathway that you can see to literally where we are right now. You know, Manafort was subverting Ukraine 20 years ago, right?
Right.
For Putin, and then at the RNC shows up, and the only thing The only thing Donald Trump's entire political platform wanted to change at the RNC
Yeah.
was Ukraine. And it was just, at the time, I remember that happening and thinking, what the fuck? Pardon my French. It didn't make any sense. But now in context, it does. And I
Yeah.
just wanted to get your
Before you answer that question, I want to read a quote from Jane Mayer from the New Yorker, where she's talking exactly about what Jim brought up, but she's looping in Stone, Roger Stone. So she said, and this was in Get Me Roger Stone, the documentary, when people think of Washington corruption, they think of organizations like Black, Manafort, and Stone. They shook down dictators, took all their money, and then tried to take America's government and make them serve the dictator's interest. It is the swamp. And I bring that up because I'm doing an American Monster series for my Substack, and Paul Manafort was number 1 and Roger Stone is number 2. Their influence on the times in which we're living cannot be understated. So I just wanted to add Jane's quote to Jim's question.
Right. No, well, they were known as the torturer's lobby or the dictator's lobby, and they were the first Washington lobbying firm who's aggressively sought out horrible torturers and dictators who, of course, have bills they want before Congress and will pay handsomely for that. And they started doing that in the 90s. I mean, a friend of mine, Art Levine, did a brilliant piece in, I think it was 1992, in Spy magazine. Very, very comical, making fun of them. And he actually dressed up as a Nazi and tried to get them to represent him. Art, of course, being Jewish, but asked if they could help put a good face on solving the Jewish problem. But I mean, so to me, it was comical more than 30 years ago. And yet Manafort he really sort of pimped himself out to Vladimir Putin. I forget the exact sum, but I believe over $70 million went into his businesses while he and his companies were working in Ukraine. And effectively, this was hybrid warfare at its best, perhaps, when they got Yanukovych in office in Ukraine, and suddenly Putin had his guy running Ukraine, and he had gotten in there after being groomed by Manafort to look more like a centrist, more like a pro-West person, but he really wasn't. It was a bunch of crap, really.
Yeah.
And that was Putin's strategy at its most successful. And then what we saw immediately, Manafort, having groomed Yanukovych and put him in office, comes over to the United States and becomes campaign manager for Trump and in the 2016 campaign. I also thought one of the staggering lapses in journalism was the New York Times coverage was just terrible. And the first piece announcing Manafort's taking over the Trump campaign, they characterized him as someone with, they brought the campaign gravitas because he had foreign policy experience.
Oh my God.
Do I need to explain?
No, it's like a dereliction of duty. There's a great Jason Stanley quote that I use all the time about how the normalization warriors are central to the fascist creep. And I believe that the normalization that went on at places like the New York Times, and also Manafort was interviewed all over cable news as if he was some, legitimate character and not basically spy adjacent. And go ahead.
Not adjacent.
Understand. I don't know if most people understand how reporters work and why that keeps happening. And it's because if you don't do that, you don't have any access to them.
Yeah.
And if you're on cable news, you want to get him on camera. If you're a reporter for the New York Times, you want to quote from his mouth. And if you're nice to him and you do what's called an apple polisher and say, oh, he's bringing the campaign gravitas.
Yeah.
That piece was written by Maggie Haberman and Alex Burns.
Yeah.
What was interesting is I saw a piece that written about Manafort 2 years earlier for Politico that was much, much tougher. So they knew what the deal was. And to me, what it read like as a reporter reading between the lines they're saying to Manafort, look, you feed us stories and we'll be nice to you.
It's unbelievable, but it's so dangerous. What we are dealing with is, you know, crises in national security. And I just revisited Get Me Roger Stone, the documentary that was done preceding the election of 2016 and right around that time. And I'm still chilled by two quotes from Manafort, who was interviewed about his partner in there, where he said, Roger's relationship with Trump has been so interconnected, it's hard to define what's Roger and what's Donald. While it'll clearly be a Trump presidency, I think it'll be influenced by Stone philosophy. And he said, if Trump is elected president, Roger will see one more very significant impact he's had on world history. And when you look where Roger Stone was in our history, all these moments from being a footnote in Watergate at the age of 19 to the Brooks Brothers riot and on, this really feels like a very dangerous Roger Stone production that we are still living through. And quite frankly, I don't know if we're going to make it.
Right. Well, if you're talking about Roger Stone and Manafort that way, the one person who's missing is the dark satanic prince of politics, Roy Cohn. And Roy Cohn introduced all those people. He introduced Roger Stone and Manafort to Trump. He was Trump's lawyer. He died in 1986, and I gathered younger people he's long missing. But he is one of those great, I'm going to say satanic instead of iconic figures in American politics. He was ruthless beyond belief. And he is the sort of the godfather overseeing the lies that we've seen from Trump, you know, what we've seen with the whole MAGA movement.
Right. And Wayne Barrett, the dearly departed investigative reporter for the Village Voice, called him the most evil person that he ever covered. So if anybody wants to get a framework for Roy Cohn, I think that helps.
Right. I had one I regarded as a badge of courage. Years ago, I was at New York Magazine about 40 years ago, and we were covering, Studio 54 was laundering money, and they were represented by Roy Cohn, and we were doing a big investigative story on it. So Roy Cohn called me up and yelled at me every obscenity in the book and said if we go ahead with the story, he'd ruin us. And then we went ahead with the story, and they went to jail, and they never got back to me.
That's Ian Schrager, right?
Ian Schrager and Steve Rubin. Right.
Ian Schrager later came to Los Angeles, and I became acquainted with him. And he is one. I think he was related to the Mondrian, or I'm trying to remember which. But he actually hand wrote me a thank you card with something I wrote when I was the nightclub writer for the LA Times. So it's interesting because again, one of the key things when I was revisiting Roger Stone was the then editor of the Daily Beast said, I don't want to get to know him because I know that he can be very charming, and yet I have to cover him. So he purposefully kept a distance because so many of these folks that take these gangster-like tactics can be so charming. And then you have that kind of access, and then you're sort of down the rabbit hole being manipulated away from the truth. Yes, Hi-Fi.
I need to point out something. Roy Cohn, a political type, is pissed off about a story about money laundering. Donald Trump, now a political type, was doing a bunch of Russian money laundering. When are people going to catch on that these political operations these people run take a ton of money, and thus there's probably a ton of money laundering going around? I mean, you've seen it in everything you've done, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, obviously, I wish they would tighten up the regulations on money laundering, and they haven't. And I just, this is one of the problems with Washington is the lobbying, and essentially, you have real estate tycoons who have loads and loads of money, will buy lawyers who will lobby it through, and that's what happens. And it's hard for It's not on any ballot, these regulations.
It's insane. You're the one who tipped me off to William Sessions, ultimately representing Semyon Mogilevich, and then that's how I found out that Bob Dole was the one who reputation washed Oleg Deripaska. And there's this whole really just sleazy history of this. But what it's done is it's made our country unsafe at the highest levels. And I do think that the 2016 election was that tipping point. And what do we do from here? Like when you have the former head of the FBI and you have somebody with Bob Dole's connections representing the Russian mob to reputation wash them, that is a problem of national security.
And it's not just Sessions. Louis Freeh was head of the FBI. He ended up representing Prevazon. And ends up with a $10 million home in Palm Beach, just around the corner from Mar-a-Lago. I mean, and imagine if you were an honest, hardworking FBI guy investigating the Russian mafia, and you'd say, "Oops, my last two bosses are making millions from the guys I'm investigating. What does that do to your investigation?" And I think that kind of thing's been happening a lot.
Well, I just wanted to bring up, Charles McGonigal, who, was at the center of a lot of in 2016 and was indicted for being an asset of the Kremlin, Kalimnik specifically. So there was a ton, there has been and obviously is a ton of Kremlin influence, at the highest levels of law enforcement. One question I had for you is what I've seen in the last year or two is like an openness, right? We've been talking about a lot of subversive kind of things to benefit Putin and Russia, money laundering and things that happen behind the scenes. But now these guys are just out there, right out front, saying, "Yeah, Putin is awesome, and Ukraine we need to throw in the trash." How did that happen? And what can we possibly? How can we explain to people that's not normal?
Right. I went back in the House of Trump well into the 90s, and if you remember Tom DeLay, when he was Speaker of the House, he was going over to Moscow, and they would end up putting money into political action company corporations that would help Tom DeLay. So this has been going on for a long time. It's also to understand the power of this dark money, its power was amped up enormously by Citizens United, because now it's easy enough for Russians to get their money into some of these political action committees. And the Republican Senatorial Campaign Committee has been funded by Russians again and again and again. Not Berezovsky. I'm sorry, I'm forgetting my oligarchs. But a lot of money went through. So dozens of them are sort of bought off, or they can tell which way the wind is blowing. It's so prevalent that it's hard to. It's more than one person's job to do an exhaustive examination of this. But it's clear that our campaign finance laws have been completely gutted. I'm old enough to have lived through Watergate. And in the aftermath of Watergate, there were all these campaign finance reform acts, and they've all been, you see this again and again. Washington lawyers will find loopholes, they'll create new mechanisms for working around regulations, and they do it again and again and again. And whatever reforms went in after Watergate have long been gutted and weakened so much that they're non-existent.
Can I just point out that, of course, Roger Stone was part of Nixon's political machine, and he's been around since then. So,
yeah.
Roger, of course, has I've interviewed him several times, but he has a tattoo of Nixon on
Yes.
his neck, and these
Yes.
names.
Yes. Another great Wayne Barrett quote is like, if Roy Cohen's the guy that you want to, really emulate, early on in your career, it basically says that you're already starting out soulless, something to that effect. Stone does say that the Nixon tattoo is to represent resilience. I don't know. That the Nixon would not be the tattoo that I would get to represent resilience. So we have not spoken to you since the federal indictments come down from Jack Smith's special counsel, who's 3 minutes in front of the camera did so much to cut through billions of dollars in disinformation because he just kind of gave it to us straight. I'd like your comment on that. I'm sure it does not surprise you.
Right.
And then I want to talk about some of the seditious conspiracy convictions we've seen, and also what we think might happen from here.
No, well, so far as I can tell, Jack Smith has been great so far, and I think he's going for it. I mean, obviously, I don't have particular knowledge as to inside workings of the Justice Department or Judge Cannon in Florida, but obviously there are hurdles to leap, and timing is an issue, and all that. I think Jack Smith is going full steam ahead, though.
Yes. Now, we have been talking about some people whose friends just got rung up with long convictions for seditious conspiracy. If you were somebody like Donald Trump, Mike Flynn, Roger Stone, would you have concern about Jack Smith possibly, approaching you with indictments related to the planning of January 6th?
Well, it's hard to get into Trump's mind. I really don't go there. But of course, I mean, I think there's an incredibly strong case against him, and I think Smith is building it. And I don't know exactly what's going on with Rudy Giuliani, but who's become so unreliable. But it'll be interesting to see if he flips.
Well, it's interesting because we had Martin Shield recently was a guest at one of my speakeasies, and he basically said Rudy got to be queen for a day, which is a phrase I hadn't heard before. But it's when you can actually reveal what without any hesitation, because you can't be held accountable for it, allegedly. And I'd be so curious because, again, when you say he's become unreliable, he's not who he was in the 80s. He's not even who he was in 2016.
Right. Now, well, I guess he has been disbarred already, right?
He has, yes. Finally.
Not a moment too soon. Yeah. No, I kind of think the MAGA facade is being chipped away and eroded, and I think one of the key questions is how does that unravel? At what pace? And will Trump storm through the primaries and get it and hold it together for the election? In which case, I still don't think he's going to be strong enough to win a legitimate popular vote. But he could be quite dangerous given all their tricks and whatever they try to pull. I don't know. I don't want to try to game out the election.
Yeah.
There are too many factors. It's too fluid.
Yeah. So the only thing I want to ask you before we end this, unless the gentlemen have more questions, is I think it's very important when we think that past is prologue, and we take a look at what happened in 2016, and we take a look at that October surprise with James Comey reopening the emails. And again, in my studies of Roger Stone right now and Manafort, and knowing Charles McGonigal was, affected by Russia, I just look at that period and wonder if this was not an operation more than some, sort of random, events that occurred. And I know Jim has a strong beliefs there, but as I was revisiting that period, that where Hillary's election was doomed, it sure as shit felt like some sort of production that, with strings being pulled that maybe we couldn't see. And that is I bring it up because that's my concern heading into 2024. I don't think we've seen the bottom of some of these characters unless they get indicted and they aren't able to hurt our country.
Right. Well, I think in terms of Trump's relationship to Russia, I always described him as an asset, intelligence asset, rather than an agent. And by that, it means he's someone it's sort of an informal relationship. He's not so much tasked with specific operations, but he does something for them, they do something for him. Now, both Putin and Trump have been on losing streaks recently. And obviously, Trump doesn't have the clout. If Trump was still president, Putin would be much more powerful now. And probably would have run right through Ukraine because the United States wouldn't have come to NATO's aid or to Ukraine's aid. So, I think that's part of him. They're both sort of wounded. They're both sort of Putin and Trump, and we'll have to see how it works out together. I'm not good at predicting what's happening next.
Oh man, I just love that. I think that's a great ending point. The wounding of Putin and Trump. I absolutely love that. Or the wounding of Trump and Putin, because yes, together on the world stage, they are linked. High five. And
being wounded means they're dangerous too.
Cornered and wounded animals are the most dangerous kind.
Right.
I would like to ask you a question, and the question is, it's about Donald Trump's character. But and I know you don't want to game out what's going on, but I'm putting myself in Jack Smith's shoes, and if I were Jack Smith, I know that the biggest hammer I can bring down on Donald Trump is the threat of death. Right? Espionage, insurrection, right? That is punishable through execution. So if I bring that to Donald Trump and I say, unless you break and tell us everything, this is what we're going to do. Do you think Donald Trump will stand up to that? Or do you think Donald Trump will crack?
Well, Donald Trump has his own 747. I would say I would put him as a high risk flight risk,
Yeah.
But I don't know how that will. He may want to play the martyr. I mean, and think that he can do something that way.
The martyr's been good for his bottom line. Victimhood's been good for his bottom line.
The idea of a billionaire victim is.
I know. But to your point, I mapped out all of Paul Manafort's clients. It never ends well. It ends with fleeing to Moscow with 40 of your, most corrupt cronies. It ends with dictator heart attacks. It ends in revolutions. It doesn't end well for Manafort's clients.
Like defenestration.
Wow, what a great interview. Oh, I'm so glad we were able to catch up with you. Everybody can find out more about Craig Unger at craigunger.com. You can buy his books there. I recommend you do. American Kompromat is vital to our understanding of just how much of an asset Trump has been to the Russians, and also House of Trump, House of Putin is also very vital. And can't wait for you to come back when you drop your next book, because I think that period of time that you're focusing on is really important. Anything else, gentlemen, before we let Craig go?
No, just thank you as always for your work and for being here. I would never have been here for your work. Because it was so clarifying about all of this. So, just thank you.
Well, thank you, Jim. I appreciate it.
You bet.
When the Trump campaign was caught colluding with Russia, the American people were promised a counterintelligence investigation.
The FBI is investigating the Russian government.
But the Trump Justice Department quashed it. Now, for the first time, Hear the true story of Donald Trump's Russian recruitment, told from inside the KGB. While Trump is gone, the Russian operation never ended, and as Americans, we cannot move on until we understand the lies, corruption, and blackmail that compromised the most powerful nation on earth. From best-selling author Craig Unger, American Kompromat.